Bom dia a todos. Estamos começando mais uma reunião do Grupo de Estudos Perspectivas Contemporâneas da Jurisdição Constitucional. Assim como temos feito durante todas as semanas, sempre às 10 horas da manhã, e hoje nós teremos o prazer e a honra imensa de receber aqui no nosso grupo o professor Steffen Augsberg. Ele é professor catedrático da Justus Liebig, Universität de Gießen, e também é membro do Conselho de Ética do governo alemão, que é um conselho muito importante, toma decisões muito importantes para a política de saúde, principalmente relacionados a temas que demandam grande reflexão ética, como o uso de células-tronco, entre outros temas de uma dimensão constitucional muito relevante. E hoje nós teremos a valiosa oportunidade de ouvi-lo sobre as escolhas trágicas que o Conselho de Ética alemão tem se deparado nesses tempos de pandemia. Assim como em outras oportunidades que já tivemos aqui no grupo de receber professores estrangeiros, o IDP está oferecendo o serviço em tempo real de tradução simultânea. Portanto, pediria para todos aqueles que nos acompanham pelo YouTube, caso queiram acompanhar o evento com uma tradução simultânea para a língua portuguesa, por favor, tentem entrar na nossa plataforma por meio do Zoom. No nosso balãozinho de comentários aqui no YouTube, nós disponibilizamos o link para que vocês possam acessar a reunião pelo Zoom, e lá, pelo Zoom, na barra inferior, é possível escolher a opção de tradução e, clicando lá em português, vocês vão conseguir ouvir o evento em tempo real, traduzido para o português. Portanto, feitas as considerações iniciais, eu passo a palavra ao ministro Gilmar Mendes para a apresentação do nosso convidado.
Bom dia a todos, cumprimentar o Vitor, cumprimentar o professor Steffen Augsberg, dizer que nós estamos muito honrados com a sua presença aqui. Hoje, professor titular da Universidade de Gießen, que vai nos falar sobre um tema que também tem grande relevância no Brasil, a discussão sobre as chamadas escolhas trágicas, ele que participa desse importante Conselho de Ética do governo alemão, que trata dessa temática. Sem maiores delongas, nós queremos passar a palavra ao professor Steffen para a sua palestra e, em seguida, haverá a oportunidade de nós dirigirmos a ele perguntas. Muito obrigado, professor. Bom dia.
Thank you so much. Can you see the presentation now? Is that okay? Can you see the presentation?
Eu ainda não consigo.
Okay.
Agora sim.
Okay, so now you have it. Okay, what I would like to tell you is, I'm trying to describe to you a situation that we were faced with a couple of weeks ago as the German Ethics Council. And the first thing to say is that the German Ethics Council, a specific body, has been created in order to act as some sort of a guide to both the legislator and the government. So we are 26 members, 13 of which are elected by parliament and 13 of which are chosen by the German government. And we were in some sort of a limbo in when the coronavirus crisis really hit, because we were supposed to have ended our first official period, or last official period of 4 years that we are elected for in March. at the end of March. So we were supposed to be re-elected, or some members had to leave the Ethics Council at the end of March. And there was supposed to be an election process going on, and that didn't really work. But it also meant that we were not sure how we didn't have any official meetings at the time, but we felt that it was strongly needed to raise the voices, as it were, and at least try to give some guidance on some specific problems that we thought were worth mentioning. And so what we did is we came together via Zoom or via telephone conferences, and within a week or so, we wrote a short paper that addressed 3 major problems that I'm going to talk to you about. So I want to say something about the way we work, then I wanted to tell you what we were faced with in March and what we were aiming for in that recommendations. And then I'm focusing on the idea of how to deal with triage situations. That's the tragic choices that I have taken the title from. And the other 2 points that we made are also included in that short recommendation, but I'm not going to stress that today. If you want to, maybe you can talk about that later in the discussion. But we also felt strongly that it was needed at a very early point in the crisis to talk about how we would actually end these rather strict measurements that have been initiated by that time. So not only what we were trying to lay down was not saying, well, these are the criteria that and now this is why we have to end these restrictions now. But we were trying to say, well, we have to talk about under which conditions and regarding which criteria we can actually start a process of renormalization. And the idea being that it may be too early to actually lift the restrictions, but it's not too early to talk about criteria and the processes that lead to these possible then later lifting of the restrictions. And another short point that we made was that it's important that even though expert advice is needed, it is also important that politicians as such have to take the hard decisions. So they can't rely on experts in a way as to say, well, they lead the way. And that's something that has been talked about a lot regarding the climate crisis. You'll remember the slogan, follow the science. Well, the problem is the science isn't normally presented in the singular. So the science in itself is a very pluralistic world, and it's very complicated to come up with a singular scientific viewpoint. And we wanted to stress, and we did stress in the paper, that actually the politicians have to take into account a number of factors. And among those, of course, an important one is the view given by scientists and experts as such. But by us, if you want to. So we wanted to underline that actually we are just one voice in a concert of many, and we think that it's important, and we think that the arguments that we presented are important ones, but we also wanted to lay down that actually it's not all about that. It's not something that we are telling the government or are telling the German parliament how to act, but we are actually encouraging them to come up with a position of their own. And so that's just something that I'm not going to divulge you further in. What you see here is a picture from a press conference, and I'm only trying to tell you something about the process in which we worked in order to make you understand that it's a really, really short time frame that we work with. So we were asked by the Federal Ministry of Health to come up with a statement on triage situations on March the 20th. By that time, we had already had talks privately amongst the members of the Ethics Council that actually we would have to come up with a short recommendation of sorts. And so there was a peculiar parallel train of thought within the ministry and within our body. And we came up on the idea that we actually wanted to write about triage situations, but we didn't want to write only about triage situation. Then we asked the members, we asked which members from the Ethics Council would be most interested in working together. 26 members, as you can imagine, it's not very likely. It's very highly unlikely you can work effectively in a close number of short period of time, in just a couple of days. So we found a smaller number, 9 members that worked together. Then we wrote it in about 4 days, I think 4 or 5 days. We wrote the recommendation, and it's interesting because it includes legal aspects, ethical aspects, medical aspects. So it's sort of, in a nutshell, what the Ethics Council is all about. It's an interdisciplinary, a pluralist body that's trying to incorporate different points of view from different areas of expertise. And we wrote the recommendation in a very short period of time, and then we had to present it to our colleagues in the Ethics Council first. So we had to get the approval by the other 17 members. And fortunately, they gave their approval, but it was a longer struggle, as it were. So we had to change quite a lot. We got some very valuable insight and input from our colleagues, of course, but it took about the same time then again to come up with a final version that we presented on the March the 27th. And then we had a press conference on April the 7th. And we thought at the time that giving a press conference 9 days after the initial release of the recommendations, maybe that we would be a little bit late, that the media would concentrate on other areas. But for whatever reasons, we were really lucky with that specific date, April the 7th, because at that time, people were beginning to question whether the restrictions should be loosened, whether it's actually, whether there should be some sort of normalization strategy within government. The Austrian Chancellor had, in an interview, said that Austria was going to lift, or at least some of the restrictions, whereas the German Chancellor almost, well, just a short while later said, no, we don't think the time is right for that yet. And people were beginning to question this position. And we actually came up with a conditioned response to the challenge here, saying, well, it's, as I said, it might be too early to lift the restrictions, but it's not too early to talk about why and when we can lift them. And that's something that has been received pretty well in the press and in the German media in general. So we were somewhat surprised by that, because the Ethics Council is of course an important body as such, but we have issued larger guidelines and larger recommendations in earlier years that have not received that much public attention. So maybe it's also a sign of the times that actually in the crisis, people turn to someone in order to get some advice. But we found it interesting that there was so much attention turned in our direction, as it were. So what we are trying to say with regard to the situation in general is that we found the basic problem being that actually we have to come up with a solution that allows us to keep our system of health fully operational, or to avoid situations where within the health systems, some parts and then maybe larger parts and even larger parts fail to function. So a kind of domino effect that we feared would come into place if the restrictions were not regarded properly. And so that is the basic background of what we were trying to explain, saying, well, we have to find that there is a specific danger here regarding the whole of society. So it's not just the so-called risk groups that are threatened here, but it's basically the whole of society, because once the health system starts to fail in specific parts of it, as I say, and then that will spread, and then that will potentially reach at least a larger part of the populace, and potentially the whole of the populace. So at least a large number of people will be affected, not only those that have been grouped as being specifically at risk persons. So you see the last part, we think we need to talk about how we get out of this logic of ever further restrictions. We also wanted to point out, and we did point out in the paper, that even though there is a strong point to make to come up with these restrictive measurements, because it's so important to stop the spreading of the virus, to flatten the curve, as we were all used to saying. It is also important to note that actually those measurements have side effects, have caused collateral damage that might be very, very, very negative, so might be highly problematic. And we wanted to point out that these aspects are gaining in importance the further the restrictions are moved along. So we have to take into account that after something that might be okay for a couple of weeks might not be okay for a couple of months, just because society can't deal with it any longer. And then that means that we had three major objectives that we wanted to come up. We thought the first one was to actually say we have to confront the major ethical conflicts, and we want to safeguard our health system, and at the same time we want to see which problems arise from inflicting specific problems by these restrictive measurements. So we wanted to invite, as I said, invite politicians to take their responsibility seriously, to acknowledge that they're the ones that have to take the hard decisions. We wanted to, at the same time, point out that there are specific normative guidelines that can be, or that have to be taken into account when dealing with triage situations. And then the third one was these opening up perspectives, as we call them. So we're going to show you at least some criteria that we think might be important materially as well as procedurally with regard to how we can find our way back to some sort of normality, not a status quo ante as it was before, but something that is at least closer to normality than what we are having at the moment, or what we were having back in March and April. So that leaves me to the triage situations. And I have to say, as an aside, or maybe before I started to talk about what we wrote in the paper, Germany has been very lucky in this regard. So the criteria that we assembled, the criteria that we presented in the paper, none of them had to be taken into practice, put into practice yet in Germany, because we were able to avoid these triage situations. And we think that because these situations and the decisions that have to be taken are so problematic, so tragic, it is worth almost, of course, everything to be able to avoid them. And we are very happy and lucky to so far have been able to avoid them. The first reason, of course, being that we just weren't hit as hard and as early by the crisis as other countries were. So our friends in Italy were hit about 2 weeks or 3 weeks earlier than we were in the north of Italy. And that meant that the German system was able to prepare at least in some way for what was to come. The second part was that the German health system, as it is, was already much better prepared, was already much more stable, and we had much more intensive care units, for example. So we were better prepared without knowing that we had to be prepared for the crisis. And the third one was that actually people then started to come up with a innovative, or at least a highly costly also as well solutions in order to create more intensive care beds, to create more apparatus for the patients, or at least for the patient that they were expected to have. So, and then of course, finally, the restrictive measures that were implemented, they had the effect that people were hoping for, or at least whether they had the effect or not, maybe that has to be decided later on, but we didn't get to see the number of patients in intensive care, in need of intensive care that we were fearing we would need. So at the moment, we can say that in the past few weeks and months, none of these triage situations have been seen in reality in Germany. And we are optimistic that even if a second wave hits, our intensive care units are at a state now that we will be able to deal with a pandemic or a second wave of the pandemic better than we were before. So maybe all of what I'm saying here is more or less theoretical for the German situation as it is. It might be less theoretical for other countries, and as I understand it, also for Brazil. So I'd be very interested to listen to your input here. So for us, it has been, as I said, we are lucky that we didn't have to put these thoughts into practice, but we still think that they're important because they make clear that there are really highly difficult questions to be answered here. So what we are trying to establish here is that there are some basic normative principles that we have to hold on to even in times of a severe crisis. So there is, as you might know or might not know, there is no state of emergency under German constitutional law. There are specific articles regarding the idea of what's called a defensive situation. So we are, when the country has to be defended, our army, of course, isn't allowed to go to war, to attack another country. But if the army were to use in that sort, it has to defend the country, then there are specific regulations for that. But there are minute details in comparison to other constitutions. So the chain of command is somewhat different than from what it usually is. So the Ministry of Defense loses its position as the last piece in the chain of command, but it goes to the Chancellor and things like that. But it's not, that only goes to show that in general there is no Ausnahmezustand, no state of emergency, no martial law under German constitutional law. And you can easily understand it if you look back in our history and see what the Weimar Constitution, how it was abused with regard especially to the specific powers. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution provided for the possibility of such specific martial law-like powers. It was abused and misused in order to help them, it at least played a part in the Nazis being able to gain power in Germany. So that's something that the German constitution refrained from regulating in the Grundgesetz, and it's something that we hold very close to our heart, that there is no martial law here, which basically means that every fundamental right is guaranteed to the full extent, to the full letter of the law, even in the most severe of crises. And so what we're experiencing at the moment is, even though there are restrictions being imposed on our people in different areas of life, the standard of legitimacy that has to be applied is the same as everywhere. So the crisis hasn't changed that. There is no possibility to turn a switch and say, well, for example, there is no possibility to use your freedom of assembly or something, or your freedom of speech or whatever you want to take into account here. And we think that it's a very important part, especially with regards to the triage situations, because one of the most basic material lessons that we have taken from our specific history is that we abhor the idea of differentiating between different human beings. There are no Übermensch, no underhuman. There is just one single kind of humanity, just one single kind of man. And that means that the state is prohibited from making these distinctions. Every human life has to be valued the same. The state must not make a distinction here. It is barred from even coming up with criteria how these differentiations could be made, and that's not something that goes back a long time in German history, but it's something that has been seen I'd say throughout the history of the German Constitutional Court, for example. And at the end of February, just this year, the German Constitutional Court came up with a judgment on a specific a norm within the Penal Code, 217 of the Penal Code, regarding assisted suicide. And I think the judgment in itself is rather disastrous. I think it, both with regard to the consequences as well as how the argumentation that goes. But the important part for us here, and I think the part that actually is that we will come back to later on maybe, is that the court stresses with regard to assisted suicide that it is not something that is to be limited to situations of people who are suffering from specific conditions, or who are terminally ill, or who are in the last period of their life and who are about to die, but they're suffering so much that there is the need of assisted suicide or the need to end their lives. And the court makes it very clear that these kind of criteria, this material criteria, saying someone only has the right to end his or her life when he or she is terminally ill or is suffering from a specific condition, that is not acceptable. These criteria are part of what we are calling a quantification and qualification of human life, and that is not acceptable under German law. And that's also very important for the triage situations, because it basically means that you have to take every human at the same value. You can't come up with ideas of how where to allocate the resources in a specific, from a utilitarian point of view, optimal way. So the idea, for example, or something that is being discussed at the moment, I think throughout the world, but also in Germany at the time, saying, what about old people and very young people? What about people who are in positions of responsibility? What about people that have been infected because they were working for others? So as policemen, as firemen, as nurses, or whatever. Do we take all that into account? And the German Constitution's answer, or the answer that German constitutional lawyers are giving, is pretty simple, saying no, we can't do that. If we do that, if we start qualifying human life, then we're on a very slippery slope, and it's very complicated to argue why these criteria are acceptable and others are not. So basically what the German fundamental law then gives us is but a negative approach. It is also and only telling us which criteria we must not use. So we mustn't base decisions on race or religion or the origin of. So the problem then comes that for some people, or for a lot of people, is highly counterintuitive. So, for example, the idea of age being irrelevant, saying what do we do with someone who is 85 and someone who is 5-year-old? Or we have someone who's 90 and we have a 35-year-old mother of 3. Does it make any sense to just treat them all the same? Or do we have to come up with a solution that actually takes into account these factual differences? Once again, from a constitutional law point of view, I think it's important to stress that we are not allowed to make these distinctions. But at the same time, that's the point that I'm very, very interested in, and I think this very has been misinterpreted by some circles in Germany, is we have acknowledged that even though the constitutional law takes a specific position here, it is possible that there may be other normative approaches, for example, medical, ethical approaches that come up with different ideas, that come up with different possible differentiations. And the constitutional law's standpoint is not the one and only, and the one that you can, that it's not the only one that you actually cling to. It is the most important one. And of course, in a hierarchy of norms, you have, at the end of the day, those are the norms that we have to obey. But at the same time, it is important to see that there is a plurality of norms at play here, and there's a plurality of understandings at play here also. So we think that it is possible to have to make a decision, or to come up with an allocation procedure that, even though we wouldn't recognize it as being legal because it doesn't strictly adhere to the principles set out by our Constitution, we might still find it acceptable. And I'm going to talk about a bit the term later on, because it is such a strong and highly problematic conflict that we're facing here. So we're trying to differentiate between two ideal types of triage situations here. Saying the first one would be actually this, what I'm referring to here now is more or less the criminal law point of view, saying, well, you can have a competitive situations, also a competition of sorts between patients, and in these ideal sort of situations, so ideal within the model, that would mean that you have two patients needing the same sort of apparatus, so a ventilator in our cases mostly, and you have two patients but only one ventilator, and they come to your hospital, to your clinic, to your intensive care unit at the same time, and you can only choose one of them. And the idea being that that's something where you have a conflict of obligations, and it is impossible to fulfill both these obligations. So the legal system doesn't give you any advice here. So whichever obligation you fulfill, you do so with the full, or you're exonerated by the law. That's a legal way of pursuing things. If you come up with a specific, or if you decide for one person or the other, and the motives and the normative background of your decisions isn't questioned by the law in these specific instances, because whatever you do, there will be only a bad situation here. You can only save one of two or maybe more patients, and from a legal point of view, it doesn't make sense to come up with a specific sanctioning for these instances, so at least it doesn't exist at the moment. So there is a discussion going on whether we should come up with a specific norm within the penal code, saying if you base your decision, for example, on a racist or a financial motivated background, then that is something that we have to sanction, to safeguard against. And the important point being, though, that the value that we would be safeguarding here, the value that would be as a play here, would not be life in itself, because whatever you do, there will be lives lost. And the idea being that even if you have something that we might find abhorrent, for example, that someone is being paid to make the decision, or someone does it because he is racist inclinations, for example, that doesn't change the fact that from there are more patients here than can be saved. So there's not a death occurring because someone is racist, but the allocation might only be based on this. And even though we might find that it's a hate crime of sorts, and we might find it necessary to come up with a new criminal provision against it, that is something that is a bit out of our perspective here. And the second one is the more complicated one, I think, and the one that the criminal lawyers are most worried about, and where the discussion takes place at the moment. So you have someone who's already has already been allocated a a life-preserving resource, so a ventilator, for example, and then someone comes in later on and needs the same machinery, the same ventilator in our example. So here, what you could do, or you have the example of someone who's 80 years old on a ventilator, and then the next patient being brought into an intensive care unit is a 15-year-old. Is it okay, or are you maybe obliged by law to extubate the 80-year-old and intubate the 15-year-old? And what we were saying, and what I still think holds true here under German law, is that whatever you do, it is an active act of killing if you extubate a person. So what you're doing here is not only have things run their course, so you don't have someone who is only dying because he's been inflicted by a specific disease, but you have someone who is dying by your hands as a physician extubating him. And that part of that kind of active killing, that has to be forbidden by the law. And that means that we're not dealing in a vacuum of normativity here. There are rules in place. You cannot do that. You are forbidden to kill someone by your very own hands. And at the same time, and that is something that we found interesting, is if you do that as a medical professional, and if you can point out that actually there are understandable and valuable thought processes involved, and you have asked your medical professions, the medical professional societies, you have asked an ethics committee at your hospital, for example, then there is a large chance, I think it's an overwhelmingly good chance, that the legal system will recognize the problematic situation that you are faced with. And that doesn't mean that the act of killing is made legal. It still remains in itself something that is forbidden as such. There is no possibility, in our view, to come up with a justification for that sort of act. But at the same time, there is a possibility of having a leniency here. And I think that's, in a way, a specific beauty or a specific functionality of the legal system, saying we have to keep up with certain values and we cannot incorporate other values within our legal system. But at the same time, there is a possibility to open up the sanctioning system, to come up with ways of a more flexible handling of the matter. And that's what we're calling leniency. And we think that that's the most important part here. But it still holds true that there, in these ex post competitive situations, that there will be no justification for the act, which means that the physicians that are being forced or feel obliged to extubate a person do in such commit a crime. And then we can only come up later with a solution with regards to how they are actually punished for it. So my concluding remarks, thank you for indulging me so far, is, as I said before, there are no good decisions to be taken here. There are only those that are a bit less problematic. And we do think, and I've written with a criminal law colleague of mine an article just last week on this, we do think that in general our legal provisions, both within the criminal law as well as the constitutional law, are sufficient to deal with these kind of situations. It is also important that we take note of the fact that there are other normative orders involved. So that's interesting to say that extra legal normative perspectives do gain a specific importance here, but that doesn't mean that they actually are to be regarded as something meta-legal or super-legal. They have to act within the boundaries set out by the constitutional law. So we see that the Constitution does mainly provide us with negative criteria and prohibits us from making these material differentiations. And we also think that it's that this approach, this very approach, is part of the the maybe very German, but in our constitutional history, very understandable idea that actually we want to safeguard the basic equality of every individual. And we think, and that's something that I'd be interested in, how you guys are actually seeing it. We think that if we were to open up our system here, if we were to allow ourselves to differentiate between different sorts of humans and different aspects of human life and value them in a specific matter, then actually that would endanger not only the specific situations in which that we're talking about, but also the legal system as a whole, because it is so grounded in the idea of a basic equality of each and every one of us. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Muito obrigado ao professor Augsberg. Foi uma apresentação realmente muito impactante, acredito que para todos nós, sobretudo não apenas pela compreensão da forma de funcionamento do Conselho de Ética e das diretrizes, mas do ponto de vista substantivo, eu acho que isso foi até um ponto já que o próprio professor Augsberg ressaltou, como a concepção do princípio da isonomia guarda particularidades realmente dentro desse sistema alemão, e acredito que seja muito distinta em alguma medida da que nós no Brasil estamos acostumados a pensar, que é ao mesmo tempo muito interessante, né, a ideia, sobretudo de não se fazer diferenciações a partir de um conceito talvez um pouco mais geral e abstrato de igualdade. É realmente muito, muito interessante. Acho que estamos todos muito impactados positivamente pela profundidade da forma como o Conselho de Ética do governo alemão tem refletido sobre esse tema. Portanto, agradecer já antecipadamente em nome de todos os nossos participantes, todos os nossos alunos, ao professor Augsberg pela profundidade da transmissão. E durante essa parte da nossa palestra, professor, nós, em geral, abrimos para questionamentos, provocações por parte dos demais alunos, né? Um ponto que eu, especificamente, gostaria de ouvir do senhor, o senhor comentou que o Conselho de Ética alemão ele respeita a decisão política, né? Ou seja, há um reconhecimento do critério científico, mas ao mesmo tempo se entende que existe um espaço de deliberação que é político, naturalmente, tanto por parte do governo quanto por parte do parlamento, enfim. Eu gostaria de entender do senhor, não sei também se a pergunta foge um pouco ao escopo da nossa discussão, mas como essa ideia de que ao lado do critério científico existe também um critério político, como ela influencia a atuação do próprio poder judicial, do próprio poder judiciário, né? Nós temos tido algumas discussões recentes aqui no Brasil, inclusive há 2 semanas, o Supremo Tribunal Federal discutiu qual seria o contorno da responsabilidade dos agentes públicos, dos gestores públicos, em decisões relacionadas à pandemia, né? Principalmente em decisões relacionadas à saúde, né? E a Suprema Corte acabou corroborando a necessidade de que os critérios científicos fossem considerados, né? Eu queria entender um pouco melhor, professor, se possível, como que na visão dos alemães, da perspectiva judicial, se entende a prevalência ou a convivência desse critério de cientificidade com outros critérios políticos ou discricionários, né, sujeitos a uma discricionalidade política.
Yes, thank you. I think we don't know yet. So it's the easy answer. For the moment, we are not at the moment in a position to say with certainty how we are going to deal with the crisis and the decisions that have been taken before, within, and after the crisis, or the worst parts of the crisis on different levels in the political spectrum. So I think it is very clear that some of the decisions have been bad, some have been good, obviously. And in general, I think we have a tendency to rely rather strongly on the judicial system in Germany. That is why, for example, a lot of the restrictive measurements that have been implemented in the last months have been taken to court, actually. So this German Constitutional Court, I have a colleague in Gießen University who's a judge of the Constitutional Court, and they are more or less being swamped, being overwhelmed by cases regarding the COVID-19 crisis. And that's the case for most, or at least for a large number of other courts in Germany as well, both on the in the civil law area as well as in the administrative law area. And so there are large numbers of cases being brought before the courts, and in some cases, in a number, quite a significant number of cases, actually, the courts have decided that the measurements that have been implemented were too strict. So they have to be scaled back, or at least. And but we're not at the point, we're not discussing, at least to my knowledge, the responsibility of political leaders. So at the moment, we're only talking about how the legality of the restrictions, but not about the responsibility of the persons that are that actually came up with the plan behind it. And I doubt that there will be a legal responsibility here. We might see a political responsibility in so far that those people might not be re-elected into parliament or into their offices again. But I don't think that it's actually there will be a legal backlash here.
Perfeito, professor. Muito obrigado. Passando agora às perguntas, nós recebemos a pergunta de um participante que faz o seguinte questionamento. Gostaria de saber a opinião do professor Augsberg sobre se na Alemanha existe a possibilidade de que os profissionais de saúde possam eventualmente recusar o atendimento, caso comprovado risco pessoal à integridade física ou psicológica. Pergunto isso porque, no Brasil, os conselhos de fiscalização de saúde estão recomendando que os profissionais de um grupo de risco, maiores de 60 anos e portadores de comorbidades, sejam afastados do atendimento direto do Covid. Mas alguns juízes, face à ausência de profissionais e diante da possibilidade de desassistência à população, estão sendo obrigados a permanecer, obrigando esses profissionais a permanecerem no atendimento, mesmo que isso importe em risco à própria vida. Como isso seria tratado na Alemanha e qual seria a opinião do professor Augsberg a esse respeito?
I think at the moment there is a rather pragmatic point of view being taken here. There are specific risks that do at least partly run against what has been guaranteed by labor safety laws, for example. So it is unclear, and it is feared that in many instances, people dealing with the COVID crisis on a daily basis, nurses, policemen, etc., are actually not supplied or have been in the past. I think it's getting better, but it's not as it should be, maybe, with the safety gear that they actually would need. So there is a problem here, and I think that's being dealt with pragmatically in a way that they basically they just get on with it. The other point that you specifically raised is, what if I am part of a risk group and I'm being asked to work in my given profession, for example, as a nurse anyway. There have been cases here, and I don't think that these people were forced to work there. So I think it was accepted, their right of refusal to work in these conditions. Also because I think it would have given a very bad example. In this case, if you were to force someone to work in conditions that he or she fears might be highly dangerous for him. So I think for these people, for these groups of people, there was a position taken, or at least in some cases it was accepted that they could refuse to work there. But it's also something that we're discussing at the moment with regard to immunity certificates. So what do we do with those that have been ill, or maybe later on that have been vaccinated? Can we use them at the front line of the fight against the virus? So is it possible to actually make a specific use of immunity by issuing certificates, at least to those who work in specific professions? But I think that's something that's closely linked to your question. In short, I think there it has been accepted that those people do not need to work in these dangerous conditions.
Perfeito. Muito obrigado, professor. Nós temos mais uma pergunta feita pelo nosso participante Cristiano Miranda de Santana. E ele questiona o seguinte: aqui no Brasil houve um aumento de ações judiciais para o controle de políticas públicas adotadas nesse período da pandemia. Porém, em regra, as ações são ajuizadas em vários juízes de primeiro grau, com a possibilidade de decisões mais díspares. Como esse controle judicial das políticas públicas de pandemia tem sido feita na Alemanha? Há um único órgão judicial competente para esse controle? E complementando aqui a pergunta do colega, professor, nós temos tido, principalmente em relação a algumas medidas, como as medidas de isolamento social, algum grau de desentendimento sobre o juiz, por parte dos juízes de primeiro grau, quanto a essas medidas, né? É um conflito que também deriva, claro, do entendimento distinto dos governadores, prefeitos e gestores públicos locais sobre a extensão da necessidade dessas medidas de isolamento, né? Mas, enfim, e o Poder Judiciário, de certo modo, acaba refletindo um pouco aqui no Brasil essas dissincronias, né? E, portanto, na Alemanha, como isso tem acontecido? Como isso tem se desenvolvido?
Well, it's interesting for me to see that both Brazil and Germany have federalist systems, and at the same time, the way they work is so different. And with regard to the judicial system and the trials that have been brought before the courts in Germany, it basically depends on where you live. So the courts all over the country have been tasked with looking at the legality and validity of these restrictions, which is due to the fact that they have been implemented mostly by the federal states as ordinances, but also by the local authorities. So depending on who acted in that regard, different courts were being addressed, and that's the case all over the country. So there's not a single body, not a single judicial actor here that takes into account what's legal and what's not, or that looks at what's legal and what's not. But it's actually a whole variety of courts all over the country, and they're from district courts, regional courts, so both within the civil laws, within the administrative law. So it's a large body of work that's being done there, and it's interestingly has led to, among others, a journal being founded. So there is a journal in Germany now, COVID-19 and the Law, and a large part of that journal consists of these judgments from the courts all over the country that are being gathered here and then find their readership, hopefully. And And it's there. That of course also means that these courts don't act in a strict synchronicity. But that's something that we have found helpful in a way. And also, even though they're not by law bound to do so, they will read what other courts have decided, and they will act in some sort of unison here, even if there's no specific form of precedent, for example. And just as an afterthought to that, from my personal point of view, so I think what we should have done, at least what we should have done better and more, is make use of the federalist system. I think we have too early and too strongly relied upon guidance by the federal level, by the German government and the chancellor as, in persona. I think it's problematic that we didn't acknowledge that the risks posed were so much different in different areas of the country. So here in the north, where I'm at the moment, in Schleswig-Holstein, it's so much different than in Hamburg, which is just a couple of kilometers down the road, but it's a metropolitan area, and it's so much different with regard to where people came from that were infected, how the infections spread. And I think it would have made very much sense to take the approach of a differentiated and also learning way of dealing with the crisis. So the one-size-fits-all model, I don't think has really worked here. So what we are seeing now is that the way out of the restrictions, there are more differentiations allowed there. But at first we were very much in line, or the states were very much in line, conferencing, coordinating with one another, and more or less doing all of them the same. So that's also part of why it makes sense for the courts to look at one another and see how they decided these cases.
Ótimo, excelente, professor. De fato, então, de certo modo, estamos dialogando com o mesmo fenômeno, a mesma situação, né? Também aqui nós temos diferenças regionais muito extremas, né, entre cada uma das nossas federações, né, o que também dá ensejo a essa multiplicidade de entendimentos. Dando continuidade, professor, eu gostaria também de formular mais uma pergunta, especificamente sobre a alocação de leitos de UTI e triagem. Nos Estados Unidos, há um movimento recente de que essas decisões, né, essas escolhas trágicas, elas possam ser, de algum modo, auxiliadas pelo uso de novas tecnologias, né, de mecanismos de inteligência artificial e algoritmos e enfim, ferramentas desse modo, semelhantes, né? Aqui no Brasil, tanto o Conselho Federal de Medicina quanto a Associação Brasileira de Medicina Intensiva tem tentado estabelecer critérios para a classificação de pacientes em graus de prioridade, né? Esse é um processo que ainda está sendo levado a cabo por essas instituições. E algumas grandes redes de hospitais possuem comitês de bioética, como, por exemplo, o Hospital Sírio-Libanês daqui de São Paulo, que é um grande hospital, que já tem se manifestado favoráveis ao uso de algoritmos para afastar obscuridades e enviesamentos na escolha de alocações de UTI. Então, esses hospitais têm, pelo menos, sinalizado, de alguma maneira, que estão abertos a utilizar algoritmos e alguns mecanismos de inteligência artificial para essas decisões de triagem. Eu queria saber do senhor se essa discussão já foi colocada na Alemanha, como os alemães enfrentam esse assunto, se a utilização de algoritmos é entendida como uma ferramenta útil nesse debate, enfim, qual que é a posição, mais ou menos, que tem sido debatida aí na Alemanha.
No, we have, of course, taken notice of the discussions on that in other countries, but I don't think it has been given much thought in Germany, because as it stands, and as it was seen a couple of weeks earlier, we didn't think it make. I think most people, at least, didn't think it would make much sense to integrate AI possibilities into these most complicated decision-making processes. And one of the reasons for that is the one that I find the most intriguing and compelling, is that AI would have to be fed certain criteria in order to, the learning that the machine has to be based on a set list of criteria. It cannot make a decision on its own. It mustn't make a decision on its own. But the only thing that it might be able to do so is identify certain factors or variables within a person. For example, if you were so inclined to include that, the age or specific health indicators, and then come up with a solution based on the idea that you have pre-fed it with the specific concept of who is more valuable than whom. And given that we are that the second premise is not being accepted, at least by me and by a lot of my colleagues, and within, I think, by the majority of the German constitutional lawyers. So it doesn't really make sense to talk about AI being able to process the information faster if we're having a specific problem with this idea of choosing as such. And to give you an example of why I think it's so complicated, why I talked about a slippery slope before. Of course, we acknowledge the success rate of an intubation, of an intensive care treatment is important. So it's part of the medical indication, and that you must not intubate someone who will not, or is not likely to survive the procedure. And at the same time, it gets very complicated if you then take that idea of success and prolong it, as it were, and say, well, if you have someone who's more likely to survive it, is that someone that you could prefer to someone who's less likely to survive it? Does it make sense to include the longevity of a person, saying, for example, well, it's someone who's, as the Swiss ethics, as the Swiss Medical Council has done, saying, well, we'll take into account the survivability of the first year after the treatment. Is that something that you find acceptable? And if you do, which other criteria are not taken into account? So you have someone who is 85 and has lived a life of caution, and by whatever chance possible has been infected by COVID-19, or has been by COVID-2, and now has been diagnosed with COVID-19. And you have someone else who is younger and has a better possibility of surviving the procedure, but his infection is due to the fact that he acted completely carelessly. From a justice point of view, I'd have no problem saying, well, there's someone who in his or her mind is responsible for something that has happened to him, and the other one isn't. The other one just by chance got the virus without being responsible for it at all. Does that make sense then to come up with a differentiation solely based on something like success rate, something based like age? So we think that it's so complicated, it gets so complicated. That's why I took about your example. If you accept some criteria and exclude others, that maybe, so that would be an interesting discussion to be had. That maybe if you had an AI solution that could integrate all these factors, that might, at least that would be an interesting approach to see. But it's also based on the fact that you would have to feed the AI the basic idea of which criteria are more valuable than others, and which are the ones that you actually rely upon.
Claro, claríssimo, professor. Muito obrigado. Nós continuamos abertos a perguntas, e tanto pela nossa plataforma no YouTube, quanto aqui pela nossa plataforma no Zoom. Um outro ponto, professor, que eu gostaria de salientar da apresentação e que nos tocou muito, foi muito interessante, é essa diferenciação entre uma avaliação ex ante e uma avaliação ex post, né, no momento da aferição das decisões. E o senhor salientou que, sobretudo, em determinadas situações, não existe, principalmente em situações em que há uma ação positiva, né, em que há uma ação positiva por parte do médico ou do profissional de saúde que está na ponta, não há propriamente como se afastar de um regime de responsabilidade um pouco mais estrito, né, um pouco mais bem delimitado. E eu queria tentar entender melhor, professor, se eu puder aprofundar um pouco mais nesse ponto, como é que seria, o senhor falou sobre critérios bem pensados e justificados e transparentes, né, para uma triagem em uma competição, vamos dizer assim, ex ante, né? Eu queria entender melhor como é que o senhor acha que esses critérios podem ser compartilhados de forma transparente com a sociedade como um todo, né? Qual seria aí mais ou menos a forma, né, de dialogar, né, de que isso pudesse ficar claro para a sociedade, como esses critérios estão sendo implementados?
Well, with regard to the ex ante situation, what we wanted to point out is simply that here, the fact that someone is dying isn't legally due to an action or an act of omittance by someone else. So someone is dying because he is sick, but not because there has been something done to him or her. So if we were to see the act of omittance as legally to attach a sort of legal responsibility for the omittance, then you would have to have an obligation to act. And you don't have an obligation to act if you can only save one out of two or more persons. So while there is no obligation to act, there is no legal importance of the omittance. So basically what you're doing then is saving one person, and with regard to the other person, you're impossibilium nemo est obligatio. So it's just the legal system cannot force you and doesn't oblige you to do something that you cannot do. So it's an old, of course, Roman law saying, and it's interesting here again, because we would just wanted to stress that it's that basically means that you can choose whomever you want in that ex ante situation. From the criminal law point of view, it just doesn't make any difference, because you're not obliged to do more than just save one, and it's pretty much from a legal point of view up to you which one you do save. And that changes with regard to the ex post situation, because then it's actually a positive act of killing someone, because you extubate him or her. And here we see the possibility to come up with to rely upon the leniency of the legal system. And your question, I think, was regarding towards the possibility how these criteria could be discussed within society. And that is something that that because has been debated here. What we had was that the medical professional societies that came up with a specific sort of guideline for their members and for the physicians in the intensive care units, that they discussed it amongst themselves and within medical ethicists, which criteria they would find acceptable. And interestingly, the first version of that guidelines was published more or less at the same time as our recommendation. And we found it problematic in some aspects, specifically with regards to the longevity of the patients, the longer term consequences of the treatments. And that has been part of a public discussion later on. And in the second version that they issued just a couple of weeks ago, they changed that. So they are now more closely relying on, or more closely linking the decision-making process to the specific success rate of the treatment, saying, well, who is more likely to survive the intubation and the part of being ventilated? And that's the only criteria that they actually hold very close. And then they have a sort of frailty scale, which is problematic in itself. But the hard criterion that they use is the one saying, well, which is the success rate with regard to the specific treatment. And so that has changed. And I think that's something that has been going on all the time. There have been other professional societies have come up with different guidelines. So they had to compare, or at least to, and sometimes maybe even to distinguish themselves from the other professional societies. And that's something that's going on at the moment. And there probably won't be the one and only true solution, but there will be a couple of possible ethically viable ways of dealing with it. And what we think is interesting is that actually from a legal point of view, you don't have to come up with the one ethical or medically responsible way. You can say, well, if someone in these tragic situations where you really can't have a good solution, if you have someone who has at least made the effort to consult with his ethics committee, to consult with his professional societies, and then made a decision that's not based on bias, that's not based on specific non-acceptable values, but is trying to keep in line with what his or her colleagues, for example, are saying, then there's a chance that the legal system will accept it without incorporating it.
Perfeito, professor. Muito obrigado. Nós temos mais participantes formulando perguntas. Eu vou aproveitar os minutos que nos restam para passar elas rapidamente. O Anderson Fust, o professor Anderson Fust, de São Paulo, nos faz a seguinte pergunta. No Brasil, não há critérios centralizados para alocação de leitos e recursos escassos na UTI nessa situação da pandemia. Na falta disso, diversos hospitais e conselhos regionais de profissionais de saúde, além de outras entidades representativas, têm criado os critérios próprios. Invariavelmente, o critério etário aparece disfarçado de critério científico. Como na Alemanha se tem evitado isso, de modo a respeitar todas as vidas igualmente?
Well, I think all the medical societies that have issued their own guidelines have stressed that age cannot be a criterion. So that's the first one, and then that has been made clear very early on in the process. I think that age in itself doesn't make you part of a risk group, neither with regard to being infected at all, now with regard to the selection processes later on. But again, of course, the specific society of intensive care physicians that have came up with the most prominent set of rules. They included, as I said before, a frailty scale, saying, well, if your frailty goes beyond number 7, then the likelihood of you surviving the treatment of being on a ventilator reduces significantly, because your condition as it is so bad that actually being intubated makes it even worse. So, and that also, of course, it can be linked to the idea of age, but it's not just age. It's not just being 80 and then you're out. It's something that is more closely linked to the actual specific state of health of a person, his or her medical preconditions, and that might be better with an 80-year-old than with a 70-year-old or a 60-year-old, or maybe even a 50-year-old. But of course, age is not completely out of the picture, and that's one of the reasons we think it's complicated and problematic.
Obrigado, professor. Nós temos mais uma pergunta final, no tempo aqui, curto tempo que nos resta, feita pelo professor Vitor Pinheiro, que é professor aqui do IDP. E ele faz o seguinte questionamento. O professor Augsberg tem notícia ou espera que o Bundesverfassungsgericht amplie as exigências de fundamentação empírica sólida, tal qual feito no caso Hartz 4, inconstitucionalidade de benefício assistencial por falta de dados adequados, em relação ao legislador ou à administração para a atual crise? Em outras palavras, as decisões legislativas e administrativas tomadas nessa crise possivelmente terão a sua constitucionalidade avaliada por um parâmetro de rigor científico maior ou mais rígido do que o usual?
In short, no. So, no, I can't imagine that it will happen. I don't think that it is the scope that has been granted and the for the to the political decision makers is so great, and it's so complicated given the degree of uncertainty that we are all operating under, to come up with a specific critique of the legislator or the administrative bodies on different levels of the within the country. I think it would be very, very complicated to come up with to criticize them on the basis of constitutionality. I think there's a specific wriggle room, as it were, for politicians in this matter, and we would have to find someone acting against his or her better knowledge in actually to come up with a specific reprehensible behavior. And I don't think we have that. I think at the moment all we can say is that there have been bad decisions being taken by our politicians, and but that was to be expected in a way. And I don't think there is a specific judicial recourse for that. So it's more or less something that will remain within the political landscape, and even there, most people are content with how the crisis is being dealt with. So the problems are being noted. It's not as if we're not talking about that specific paths that we chose might have been the wrong ones, or definitely were the wrong ones. But I think it's mostly being accepted as being forced to operate under conditions where we don't know the very basic epistemic background, and so all we can do is just put a long stick in the fog and hope that we touch something.
Ok, muito obrigado, professor. Estamos exatamente atingindo aqui o nosso limite de tempo do nosso encontro. Gostaria já de antemão agradecer muitíssimo ao professor Augsberg por ter respondido as perguntas de todos os nossos participantes, por ter aceitado dialogar com a gente durante esse período, e passaria a palavra ao ministro Gilmar Mendes para as considerações finais desse encontro.
Professor Steffen Augsberg, muito obrigado por essa explanação e também por ter se disposto a responder a essas perguntas sobre um tema que, como viu, desperta muito interesse no nosso público, no público brasileiro, que está lidando com toda essa temática do direito à saúde em tempos de pandemia. Esperamos que, superado esse quadro, nós tenhamos a sua presença aqui em algum seminário em que possamos prosseguir esse diálogo. Acho que foi extremamente produtivo, como vimos das provocações que foram feitas. Nós estamos realmente muito honrados com sua presença neste nosso webinar. Esteja bem. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. The honor is all mine. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Also for the enlightened questions.
Obrigado a todos, mais uma vez, em nome de toda a comunidade acadêmica do IDP, todos os alunos, professores. Gostaria muitíssimo de agradecer ao professor Augsberg, e gostaria também de dizer a todos que nós continuamos as nossas atividades regularmente, sempre às segundas-feiras, às 10 horas, e na próxima segunda-feira, o nosso próximo encontro terá como tema Jurisdição Constitucional e Economia de Plataformas, o debate sobre a transformação da responsabilidade jurídica dos intermediários em tempos de pandemia. Contaremos com a presença ilustre do professor Ricardo Campos, que é assistente de cátedra na Universität, lá em Frankfurt, que também nos dará a oportunidade de debater esse tema super atual. Portanto, deixo aí o convite a todos para que continue acompanhando as nossas atividades acadêmicas durante esse período de isolamento social, para que possamos aí ter um espaço de discussão durante esse período tão difícil que todos estamos passando. Portanto, mais uma vez, agradecendo a participação de todos, eu declaro encerrado este evento. Obrigado.
And thank you, Beatrice, for a job tremendously well done.
Vielen Dank.
Agradecer também ao nosso pessoal de tradução.
Obrigado.
Beatriz, Helena, todo mundo. Obrigado a todos e nós nos
Obrigado,
vemos.
Beatriz. Bom, muito obrigado, hein?
Um abraço a todos.